At any flagship university, what is one of the distinctive things that we do is bring outstanding speakers from across the country, across the world, to enlighten our students, our faculty, and members of the community. And as a flagship university in one of the poorer states in the nation, we don't get as many opportunities to do that as we'd like. And so that's why it's wonderful when people from the community like the Skyruns step forward and make it possible for us to have this kind of outstanding opportunity.
Excuse me, we're not hearing well in parts of the auditorium.
Let's see if it works if I speak closer to the mic. Everyone else should eat the mic. So Vivian is chair of the board of directors of the Jewish Community Foundation of New Mexico, and George is an adjunct professor of physics at UNM and past president of the New Mexico chapter of the Fulbright Association. And we thank them for their help in making this possible. And now I'd like to thank Eleni Basea for her help in arranging for this and for all the wonderful work she does as the director of the International Studies Institute. And for those who didn't hear before, if you're students, you're not here because class is canceled.
Okay, good morning, friends, and thank you all for coming here with this weather. News organizations from around the world have been reporting on the recent Charlie Hebdo and Jewish supermarket killings in Paris and their broader implications in Europe. The events at the kosher supermarket in particular, and more recently in the Copenhagen synagogue, are a reminder of the sporadic but ongoing violence towards the Jewish community in Europe and beyond. Significant as this news coverage is, reporting only on instances of violence towards a Jewish or a Muslim community perpetuates the impression that a particular culture is only newsworthy when associated with the incidents of intolerance and violence. At the International Studies Institute at UNM, we endeavor to create a forum for a range of positions and presentations, and encourage our students, faculty, and the wider community to attend our events with an open mind and a commitment to dialogue. Part of the university's responsibility is to educate our community on the history and cultural contributions of each people, while also examining political events as they're unfolding at the moment. The International Studies Institute is honored to announce the inaugural lecture of the new Contemporary Jewish Studies lecture series. Professor Michael Brenner from the University of Munich and American University will be speaking on Jewish life in Europe today, crisis or revival. Dr. Brenner's background and illustrious career is summarized in your program. We're honored to have such a respected and thoughtful scholar open our Contemporary Jewish Studies lecture series. Right after his presentation, he will take questions and answers here in this room since we don't have a class following, and then there's a small reception at the lobby right afterwards. We look forward to also seeing you in our upcoming events that you see here. And I specifically want to alert you all to the second Contemporary Jewish Studies lecture series that's going to happen on September 10th or 11th, 2015, and we'll have the announcement by May 1st. Thank you very much, Michael Brenner.
Well, good morning, buenos dias, and shalom to everyone, including the students who might see this over video at some point. And it's a true honor to be back in the land of enchantment to be back in this beautiful city. Wouldn't say beautiful weather. I apologize deeply to have brought the snow from Washington, D.C., where it started yesterday morning, and for us it didn't stop. But I really appreciate you all coming here and braving this weather this morning. I would personally also thank Professor Bastia and Professor Skadron for having helped to bring me here, and I also would like to acknowledge an old friend, Professor and Rabbi John Feldman, who is here as well. And I was told now the university is closed. There's nothing else going on here. I can speak instead of 40 minutes for 2.5 hours. Everyone okay? No, but the good thing, there's always a good thing in whatever, bad circumstances there are. The good thing is we can stay here and have a discussion. So I'm looking forward to that. Sometimes questions and answers, I think, is the more important part. Let me begin with history. I can't help it. I'm a historian, and although it is a contemporary topic, I promise I will get to today, and we'll speak about contemporary European Jewry and the situation of Jews in Europe today. Let me start with a little bit of history because the topic really requires it. One of the first questions does everyone hear me well? One of the first questions I often get when I speak about Jews in Europe, and especially about Jews in Germany, it's where I grew up myself, is how is it possible, how comes that there were any Jews living in Europe and in places like Germany after the Holocaust? So let me say a few words about that history. Of course, Europe was the place with the largest, by far largest Jewish community before the Second World War. There were about over 9 million Jews living in Europe before the Second World War, and as we all know, in the most terrible genocide in modern history, about 2/3, about 6 million Jews have been or were killed by the Nazis during the Holocaust. So what was a thriving and by far the largest Jewish community in the world became, and increasingly after 1945, became a more marginal Jewish community. I think this is the first fact we have to see. Today, and these statistics are never precise, but according to estimates, there are only maybe 1.5 million Jews left in Europe. Just to get the greater picture, this is about 10% of the world Jewish population today. We have about 40% of Jews, more than 40% of Jews in Israel, and more than 40% of Jews in America, and about maybe a little bit more than 10% in Europe, out of the 15 million Jews in the world. So when we talk about post-war Europe, as I said before, there were still about 3 million Jews, probably a bit more, in Europe after 1945. And Europe, of course, never was, and today is not either, a homogeneous place. It's not it's not the case that every Jewish community shared the same fate either before or during or after the Holocaust. In fact, there were a few Jewish communities during the Second World War which were spared the fate of destruction. And I'm not talking about British Jewry, which of course was not occupied by Germany, or of course did not collaborate with Nazi Germany. But among those places which were either occupied by Nazi Germany or collaborated, there were very few places, very few countries where more or less the whole native Jewish population was saved. The best known case is Denmark, a very small Jewish community, a few thousand people who were basically brought overnight to Sweden with a lot of help by the local Danish population. And another little bit more complicated case is Bulgaria. The Bulgarian Jews, at least those who were part of Bulgaria before the war, were also saved during the war. In all other countries of Europe which were occupied by Germany or collaborated with Nazi Germany, and that was the majority of Europe at some point, Jews were deported to the extermination camps, most of them in Poland, in occupied Poland, of course, and killed, or they were killed already in the places where they lived themselves. From Greece to Poland, of course, the largest Jewish community, from France to Hungary and all the other places in Europe. So after the Holocaust, there were certain communities which were almost completely destroyed. The Greek Jewish community, for example, like 90% or more were killed in Auschwitz. There were other cases where the Jewish community was not entirely destroyed. France, for example, which was only partly occupied by Germany, and places where you still had a considerable Jewish community, but only because they were so large before the war, like Poland. There were over 3 million Jews in Poland before the Holocaust. Now, 10% of them survived, some in the concentration camps and some by going far into the Soviet Union, and often into the Asian parts of the Soviet Union, then returning after the war to Poland. So these were about 300,000 Jews from Poland, but it's only 10% of the pre-war community. And what did these Jews, for example, in Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe, what did they do after the war? Well, most of them did not want to stay. They wanted to leave not just Poland, but Europe altogether. But where could they go? Israel was not established yet in 1945. It was only established in 1948. The United States had quite restrictive immigration laws. They didn't let in many Jewish survivors. Actually, at some point, they let in more former Nazis, more former Germans than Jews. And the problem was, where would they go? We're talking about 300,000 Jews in Poland and communities in other countries of Eastern Europe where they didn't want to stay, because not only did most of them not want to live under a communist rule now, which was the case in Eastern Europe, they also encountered anti-Semitism, and that means really not just anti-Semitism in words, but real violence after their liberation, after the end of the Holocaust. In Poland, there were probably over 1,000 Jews killed by the Polish population, by parts of the Polish population, after 1945. The worst case happened in the summer of 1946 in a Polish city called Kielce, where over 40 Jews were just killed during one day. So where could they go? Ironically, the only place which they saw as a safe haven was Germany. Now, you might say, Germany of all places? Well, there wasn't really a Germany in political terms in 1945, 46, 47. There were just 4 occupied zones of Germany, and especially the US zone of Germany was very attractive as a temporary safe haven for these Polish and other East European Jewish survivors, because they thought from here, from the American zone, they could go on eventually either to a Jewish state once it's established, or to the United States. So you had the ironic fact that about 250,000 Jews from Eastern Europe ended up in Germany right after the war. They were usually called displaced persons, DPs, and many of them lived in camps, not in concentration camps, of course, but in DP camps. But it meant that they weren't entirely free to move where they wanted to go, to do what they wanted to do. They still, as many of them said, we were liberated, but we're not free. So in many ways, the Holocaust was over, but Jews were not really free yet until maybe 1948, when the State of Israel was founded, or 1949, when the United States started to let in many more immigrants than before. Most of those Jews, as I said before, in Germany now, or in Poland, or in other places, did not really want to stay in Europe altogether. One, I think, most impressive speeches I've come across in the documents I looked at was a speech by the person who was elected the president of the liberated Jews in the American zone of Germany right after the liberation in 1945. And he addressed thousands of survivors. And one of the sentences he said was, for us surviving Jews, Europe does not really mean, or when we think of Europe, he said, we don't really think of the art treasures of Florence, of the cathedrals like Westminster Abbey or the Strasbourg Cathedral. When we think of Europe, we think of the medieval crusades, of the Spanish Inquisition, of the Russian pogroms, and of Auschwitz. So this list of a long time violence and anti-Semitism against the Jews in Europe was now, after the Second World War, very much engraved in the psyche of these surviving Jews. They felt often as if they lived on a big graveyard. They felt often, as they said, they lived on a blood-stained soil of Europe. And of course, there were places which were, I would say, more bloodstained and others that were less. Eastern Europe were all the terrible, where the Germans, of course, erected all the terrible concentration extermination camps was bad. Germany itself, obviously. Other places like France and Italy, maybe less. So let me come back to Germany for a second. After 1948, after Jews had the possibility to move to the Jewish state, most of them, in fact, left Germany. Some to Israel, some to America, some to places as far away as they could imagine, like Australia or South America or South Africa, just to be far away. But still, about 10% of these 250,000 East European displaced persons actually stayed in Germany, about 25,000. And then there were about another 10 to 15,000 German Jews who somehow had managed to survive, or even those who had returned after the war from their places of emigration in order to help to rebuild a new, or actually two new Germanys, a democratic, liberal Western Germany or a socialist Eastern Germany, depending on what their political attitudes were. So you had that too. Why did maybe 25,000 East European Jews stay in a place like Germany? Everyone, of course, has his or her own answer. I think for many of them, it was simply, after all they had gone through, many had survived a lot of concentration camps. I think for a lot of them, it was just very hard to move again, physically, but also mentally. They just felt, after all, we just can't move anymore. Also, going to Israel meant going to a place which was in the middle of a war in 1948 and in 1949, and most people thought that war would not stop so soon, and they were right. There was another war and another war. It was also a country with the climate not everyone was easy to live in. It was a country economically still kind of developing country. And the United States, even if they could go there, not everyone could get a visa, Even the United States, most of them did not speak English. It was a very different life. So for whatever reasons, people decided to stay either in Germany or some even in Poland or in other parts of Europe. That was the situation in the late 1940s, early 1950s. You had small Jewish communities in still a lot of European countries, but the idea was probably in most of these places, these were communities without a future. 35,000 Jews in Germany, 40,000 Jews in Italy, maybe in the beginning 60, 70,000 Jews in Poland, many of them older people, and the younger were inclined more to leave. So you see during the 50s and 60s, the population in many of these places is becoming smaller and smaller, basically due to an overaged population, due to assimilation, because you have very small Jewish communities, very hard to find, let's say, a Jewish partner. With some exceptions. France became a community that was growing, especially in the 1960s, because a lot of North African Jews who, after places like Algeria and Tunisia became independent, were more afraid to live in an Arab country, and many of them had French citizenship. While some went to Israel, the majority actually went to France. So the majority of French Jews today are descendants, or still themselves, immigrants who came from those countries of North Africa during the 1960s. Another case were Jews who left Eastern Europe. In fact, in 1968, there was something like a second expulsion of Jews from Poland. 1968, there was a whole wave of anti-Semitism in Poland, and Jews were again blamed for political unrest, for economic instability, and the vast majority of Jews of Poland left, and many of them went to Western Europe. And finally, starting after the fall of communism, after the fall of the wall in Berlin, after the change after basically the dissolution of the Soviet Union into many states, many of the Jews from the former Soviet Union, from Russia, from Ukraine, from the Baltic states, also were free to leave, and the majority left for Israel. About 1 million Jews from the former Soviet Union left to Israel. But some went to the United States, and about 150,000 Jews since 1989 went, again, of all places, to Germany. Germany, if you want, was the only country which could not say no to Jews knocking on its doors. And some Soviet or former Soviet Jews just wanted to stay in Europe, but they didn't feel safe in the Soviet Union. They didn't want to go to Israel. They didn't want to go to America. So Germany was the other place they could go to. And they came. And in fact, today, we have about maybe close to 200,000 Jews in Germany. Remember, big change from the 35,000 Jews from the 1950s onwards. And out of these almost 200,000 Jews, maybe less than 20,000 are Jews who are not non-Soviet Jews. So it's a real population coming from Russia and other countries of the former Soviet Union. But what's the big difference today? We don't have these, I would say, reservoirs anymore. We don't have Jews in North Africa or many Jews in Russia who could go anywhere. There is no place where Europe, and that means mainly Western Europe today, would draw any Jewish immigrants from, unless they're Israelis. And I'll talk about this in a minute. But if we don't consider Israel or America places where lots of Jews would go to Europe, then you don't have this kind of natural pool anymore of possible immigrants. So even before we talk about a crisis in terms of anti-Semitism today, that's something, which of course is in the press a lot now. Even before that, a lot of scholars, especially demographers, spoke about the end of European Jewry in maybe 1 or 2 or 3 generations because of assimilation, because of an overaged population, and because of a gradual loss of Jewish identity in places where Jews are such a small minority. That means that feeling of crisis has been there for a long time, but not necessarily because there was so much anti-Semitism, but sometimes because of the opposite, like Britain. Jews felt very British. Jews felt at home in Britain. And look what happened. The Jewish population in Britain, which was still about 350 to 400,000 in the early 1970s, not that long ago, went down to just a bit more than 200,000 today because they don't identify as Jewish anymore. So this is the one problem we have when we speak about a crisis of European Jewry. It's nothing to do with anti-Semitism. The second issue really is something which started to be a serious problem only in the last year or maybe 2 years. And that is what all of you probably have read in the papers and what Elodie mentioned before, attacks on Jewish schools in France, on a synagogue in Paris, on a kosher supermarket in Paris, on a synagogue in Copenhagen. And it doesn't matter which synagogue, any synagogue you see in Europe, you recognize immediately, not because there is a huge Star of David or an Israeli flag or something like that, because there is a big police car in front of it, and probably the street is closed off a little bit, and a lot of security. And that has started already a long time ago. But the feeling of a lack of safety has certainly increased dramatically in the last couple of years. So this is another part of this crisis we feel, and it's a crisis I think that is very real. It's a crisis that you hear more and more emphasized when you hear Jews in Europe speak today. Does it mean that they all pack their bags and are waiting to go to Israel or to another place? Not really. Sure, we hear about 10,000 Jews who left France, which still has a population of, it's the largest Jewish community in Europe, has a population of over 500,000 Jews. So 10,000, I would say, is considerable, but it's not dramatic. The vast majority of Jews in France still would say, this is our home, this is our place, and we'll stay there. The same in other countries. And there is another phenomenon, that's the other part I mentioned, which is part of the title of the talk. There is also something like a revival. And that may come as a surprise to many of you, and it has started already maybe 2 decades ago, certainly after the fall of the wall. In many countries of Europe, Jews felt they actually have something to say. They're being heard. There is a huge interest in all things Jewish. So I'm teaching part of the year at the University of Munich in Germany. I would say 90 or 95% of my students are non-Jewish, and there's a huge interest. And my colleagues, it's the same situation for them. There are Jewish bookstores. There are Jewish museums now in every major city in Germany. And I just take Germany as an example. You see similar developments in Poland, where just a big and impressive Jewish museum opened in Warsaw last month. You see similar things in other places all over Europe. there are, of course, anti-Semites, and there are right-wing extremists and neo-Nazis. They're small groups, but they are dangerous and they are there. But there is also a large part of the population which tries to fight them, which is on the street protesting against anti-Semitism, which is interested in all things Jewish. And this is a phenomenon which I think is maybe a little bit less told about in the press. You have a situation in Germany, in Europe, which is quite complex. Yes, you have right-wing extremism in some countries, very, I would say, worrisome, like Hungary or Greece, where you have right-wing parties, really extreme right-wing parties in the parliament. But you don't have the situation, and I think that is important to say too, we are not in 1938, we're not in 1933, or not even 1932. All over Europe, you have governments which are, for whom it is very important to protect the Jewish population, to fight anti-Semitism. Some, I would say, more outspoken, some less. If some of you heard, and you can see that on YouTube, a speech by the French Prime Minister Valls about 2 weeks ago, passionate speech in the French Parliament, where he says over and over again, the French Jews are part of us. They are part of France, and we have to take even stronger measures to fight anti-Semitism in all its forms, and he's very passionate about that. That's something that was not the case in the 1930s. So the feeling of governments, of officials who are certainly very much inclined to protect Jewish life, this is there. But it's also a feeling that doesn't make every Jew very comfortable, because if you need the protection of the government, if the German Chancellor Angela Merkel says, we protect our Jews, we do everything to protect our Jews, you think that's, of course, also a sign. You don't want to hear that. You don't want to have a reason to hear that. So there are all of these conflicting messages in a very complex situation. As for the Jews leaving Europe, so I said there are about 10,000 who left France. Maybe there were a few hundred who left Germany, a very small number. And you always had Jews who make Aliyah from the United States too, who choose to immigrate to Israel. If you compare that with the number of Israelis moving to Europe, you'll be surprised. There are more Israelis moving to Europe than European Jews moving to Israel. In Germany now, there are about 30,000 Jews in Berlin. Berlin has become this kind of hip city for young, artsy Tel Avivians. There is a whole Israeli colony in Berlin, which caused some outrage in Israel. Actually, there was this kind of pudding or yogurt ad on Facebook, page on Facebook, where a young Israeli said, it's so cheap to buy the same yogurt, which is so much more expensive in Tel Aviv. And of course, that was just a symbol. It's very hard to live in Tel Aviv if you don't make a lot of money. It's an amazing, beautiful, vibrant city, but it's an expensive place for people who don't earn that much, like most Israelis do. And when Prime Minister Netanyahu calls for French Jews and European Jews in general to come to Israel, many of them think, well, it's nice, but weren't there like tent cities 2 years ago in Tel Aviv, and people fought to survive? And how are we going to survive with our professional life? We're physicians or lawyers, and how are we going to live there and make a living which is in any way comparable to what we do in Belgium or Holland or Italy? So I wouldn't think that the vast majority of this 1.5 million European Jews are about to leave Europe unless things get really more dramatic than they are now. At the same time, I think that many of the Jews in Europe think about this possibility more than they did 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And that is something which I think we should all be aware of. So you have a situation, again, I want to summarize, which is different in every country, and much of the difference has to do with the history. Jews in Poland may say, well, if we look back, maybe the Polish population hasn't protected us that much in 1940 or in 1946, where Italian Jews might say, you know, even during the Holocaust, and although we had our own fascism in Italy, Italians actually very often protected their Jewish neighbors. All this still plays a role in present-day Europe. And you see Israelis in some places becoming a large part of Jewish life in Europe, just as they become a large part of Jewish life in many American cities as well. You also see that people recognize that the ties between many European countries and Israel, especially in cultural and economic ways, are pretty good, not always politically. And they feel like many American Jews feel that they are French or Belgian or Italian, and that their ancestors had lived there for often hundreds of years. And it's not so easy to say, okay, just, you know, because there is a problem now, and there is a problem, we're all going to leave. So you see both sides. You have the crisis and people considering and thinking again and again, is there a future for us? And you have at the same time a revival, partly contributed to by Israelis moving there, but partly also contributed by the feeling that we feel a kind of safety Jews in Europe could not feel in the 1930s. And that's kind of the complex picture I want to leave you with, and I don't want to leave you with, I want to open the discussion with that. A European Jewry that is very much struggling between these two poles of crisis and revival. Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you, Professor Brenner. Your wonderful comments raise a couple of questions in my mind. Could you say something about the flourishing of European Jews internally, culturally, in Jewish institutions?
Absolutely.
And if I may, the second question is the Islamist terrorism in Europe likely to reduce some of the right-wing sentiment of anti-Semitism against Jews?
Right. Thank you. A very good question, and a lot of things I... Oh, yes. So there were like two questions at least. One was about the religious and cultural life of Jews in Europe, and the other one was about the Islamist extremism and how that configurates with right-wing extremism, if I understood that correctly. As for the first issue, religious life in Europe was, again, different in every place. But there is certainly a revival going on in the last 20 years. Let me take Germany as an example. When I grew up in Germany in the 1970s and 80s, in all of Germany, well, there were about 30,000 Jews. There were about 10 rabbis in Germany. Not many, because there were still like 80 Jewish communities. But 10 rabbis, and most of them were like imported. They were Israelis or some Americans. Some of them didn't speak German. It was very hard to communicate with them. Most of them were Orthodox, some ultra-Orthodox, because most of your German Jews were actually Polish Jews, as I said before, these displaced persons who came after the war, and they only knew Orthodox Judaism. But they were mostly what we would call non-practicing Orthodox Jewish communities, very Orthodox rabbis. So it was not, there was not a situation of, I would say, religious creativity, or even a feeling that there was a homegrown religious leadership. And that's dramatically changed. Since the 1990s, 3 rabbinical seminaries were established in Germany, Reform, Orthodox, and now also Conservative, very new. And they already produced rabbis, and for the first time, female rabbis as well in Germany. Let me give you an example. The place I grew up was a very small Jewish community in a small town of Bavaria. There were about 50 Jews when I grew up there. Today there are about 200, all of them almost Russian Jews. When I grew up, it was an Orthodox Jewish community with a separation barrier between men and women, Orthodox services, all the older people spoke Yiddish, and it was like a continuation of a shtetl in a way. It was also impressive, but it was not, what the younger people, in a way, wanted. And most of the younger people had left anyway. I left this place. I came back to visit. And when I came back to visit in the 90s, the separation wall was gone. There was a woman rabbi. And the service was partly in Russian. So that's just an example of how these changes, and Germany may be a little extreme example because the Jewish population increased, but it shows the revival. Let me say a few words about the Muslim part. And I'm talking here not about Muslims in Germany, but about the few but visible Islamists, radicals. And that, I would say, is the main danger, not just Germany, even more so in France, in Scandinavia, in Britain, where you have a radicalized small group among the Muslim community that indeed is ready for violence against all kinds of targets, but unfortunately, Jewish targets are in the very forefront. At the same time, there are a lot of other issues where the mainstream Muslim community goes hand in hand with the Jewish community. About 2 years ago, there was a debate in Germany, followed by some other countries, about outlawing circumcision. It was a very nasty debate, I think, very, very polarized. People were very ignorant about it, I must say. And in this case, the Muslim leadership and the Jewish leadership went together, and they said, we have, circumcision among our young boys. And this should be a right we have to practice. The same with slaughtering, kosher slaughtering, or Sharia or halal slaughtering. They would fight together. And I think in more general terms, they would fight together as minorities, as religious minorities, against the Christian majority. Let me tell you a little story, and then we have the next question. When I grew up in a small Catholic town in Bavaria, I was the only Jew in the school, in the classroom, but I always like to say there was one other Jew on the cross, on the crucifix, in the wall. So it was a public school, but the Catholic religion was very dominant, and even though in the meantime the Supreme Court in Germany outruled and said you should not have religious symbols in a public school classroom, they took it off in all German states, but not in Bavaria. So they're still there. That shows something about the dominant feeling. Also, when I came to America, only then I learned people say happy holidays in December. I don't know here, but at least in the East Coast. and not just Happy Christmas. No one would ever do this in Germany. It's Happy Christmas, and you even know this is your Turkish neighbor or your Jewish neighbor, and they still say Happy Christmas. They're not aware of the fact that not everyone celebrates Christmas. So there is not much of a feeling of this diversity. Or let's put it the other way, it's slowly developing now. You have about 3 million Muslims in Germany, only 200,000 Jews, but it's still a much more, the feeling is much more feeling of being in a minority than, let's say, in the United States. Yes, please.
I've traveled to a number of countries in Europe in the last couple of years, and I found one country that seems to be an exception to what you're saying,
Yeah.
and that was Austria. We spent some time with the head of the Jewish community in Salzburg.
Hmm.
He's not 100 years old.
I know, he's a wonderful person. He just turned 100, yeah.
He basically told us about what's been going on there, and from his perspective, the Austrian government has done nothing
Yeah,
to basically bring Jews back, nothing to make them feel comfortable,
yeah,
and he has trouble getting them in Salzburg, in the synagogue.
yeah. So the question was, or the comment, Austria is kind of an exception. He doesn't see the positive, but more the negative aspects. Austria is, there are, as I say, it's a broad range of countries. You have places like Hungary, which I would say is probably not a very good place to live now as a Jew. Austria always was very different from Germany in terms of facing its own past. They, for a long time, like to say, we were the first victims of Hitler. Now, Hitler happened to be Austrian, actually, and when the Germans took over Austria in 1938, I don't recall seeing any pictures that the masses of Austrians protested, but the masses of Austrians were there welcoming Germany. But for a long time, Austria resisted that. And actually, you know what? Many, even Jews all over the world, bought into that. Israel, for a long time, for good reason, thought we were not ready yet for diplomatic relations with Germany. But as soon as Austria became actually a sovereign state in 1955, Israel established ties with Austria. And I still remember in the 1970s when many German Jews felt so uncomfortable living in Germany when they went to Israel, and they wouldn't like to say we are from Germany, but they would speak German, obviously, and they would say, we're from Switzerland, which was better then, or better than today it wouldn't be. They would say, we're from Austria, because it sounded better. Today it's probably worse. So I agree with that. As for the special case of, basically almost all Austrian Jews live in Vienna. And they're only like maybe 7,000 or 8,000. Salzburg, which you mentioned, is a small town with a very small Jewish community. So I don't think it's because of anti-Semitism, it's just because that community never was a very big community, which also, was overage. And as you say, the head of the community now is like 101 years old. Yeah, he's an impressive person, but it tells something there is no successor. So it's complicated, but I agree with you totally. Austria is a little different case than many other countries. And they had a president called Kurt Waldheim, who was a Nazi officer. They have very strong right-wing parties, and they never really coped in the same way like some other countries with their own past. Yes?
Can you say something about the rather unique history of the Jewish community in Hungary, both with the changes after the war, through the communist occupation, then the freedom movement, and now the new rise again of a right-wing anti-Jewish
Yeah. I'll say a few words about that. A few words about the special case of the Hungarian Jewish community. Without claiming to be an expert on Hungarian Jewry, I would say a few words. Hungarian Jewry was the largest East European Jewish community to be there for many decades, for the simple reason that the Nazis didn't manage to kill all Jews in Hungary. And the other case actually was Romania, but Romanian Jews left for Israel mostly, and they were able to leave for Israel. Hungarian Jews were not. there was also the only rabbinical seminary in all of Eastern or East Central Europe existed and still exists in Budapest overall, but they had always like a handful of students, but it still existed. After 1989, there was also the feeling of revival among Hungarian Jews. In communist times, Jews could not really practice Judaism. In Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, in Russia, in Poland, there were some synagogues, and as I say, even a rabbinical seminary, but there was always a government spy, and you didn't want, I remember I was a teenager when I went in the 1980s to services in Prague in the synagogue, and there was like they had a minyan, but like 15 old men who were in there, and I said, why aren't any young people coming? And then the guy standing next to me said, you see that person sitting in the first row? He's the government spy. He writes down everyone who's here, and the young people don't want to lose their jobs. So that was the situation in all of Eastern Europe. And in Hungary, the difference was that there was still, and still is, a larger number of Jews than in all the other countries, about 100,000 Jews in Hungary, many of them also very much assimilated, even before the war. And they felt, after 1989, after the country was no longer a communist country, now we open synagogues, and in fact that happened, and we have a new cultural, secular Jewish life that happened. But in recent years, the government in Hungary has been right-wing, and parts of the supporters of the government are extreme right-wing and anti-Semitic, and there is a strong feeling of really being in a place where they are not longer safe in practicing their Jewishness openly, because the anti-Semitism, I think, in Hungary has a dimension which is different from most other European countries. Yes?
I'm sorry to